Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got his long-coveted meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden, their first since Netanyahu took office at the helm of his country's far-right government late last year. In the long-anticipated meeting in New York, U.S. President Biden offered his counterpart a warm, cordial welcome. He opened the meeting by saying the America's relationship with Israel was ironclad, further adding they would discuss some of the hard issues, including checks and balances, a reference to ongoing tensions over the Israeli leaders' judicial reform efforts.
We're going to discuss some of the hard issues, and that is upholding democratic values that lie at the heart of our partnership, including checks and balances in our systems, and preserving a path to a negotiated two-state solution, and ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon.
Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stressed common goals in his opening remarks. He said that under Biden's leadership as the president, they can forge a historic peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, further adding that he would uphold democratic values despite his proposed changes to Israel's court system. Given the concerns about Netanyahu's commitment to democratic checks and balances, the setting of the meeting was in Manhattan instead of the Oval Office, where Biden will host Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky later this week. The move is widely interpreted as linked to the Biden administration's disapproval of the Israeli government's proposed judicial reforms. The Israeli Prime Minister has not been invited to the White House since he retook his nation's top post. Let's talk more about this meeting. For more on this, we are now being joined by our correspondent Susan Teherani from New York. She is on the sidelines of this United Nations headquarters. Susan, good to see you. This was a highly anticipated meeting between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden. It has already happened. What is the major highlight of that meeting?
Yeah, Eric, as you mentioned, the concern by the United States, the Biden administration in general, regarding that judicial overhaul really made headlines prior. And then, the fact that President Biden decided to host Bibi Netanyahu here in New York as well was a topic of discussion as well. However, according to the press pool that was present before the meeting started, President Biden told Prime Minister Netanyahu that he hopes to see him in Washington before the end of the year. Another highlight and a sticking point between the two sides was relations with Iran and how to deal with Iran's menace in the region. We did hear Prime Minister Netanyahu before the meeting started by saying that while he thanks President Biden for taking Iran's nuclear activities and ambitions seriously, he said the only way to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon would be with credible military warnings, hard-hitting sanctions, and standing up for the regular people of Iran. Perhaps a jab at the recent Biden administration's deal, prisoner swap with Iran, where Iran was granted about $6 billion in its assets. So that's another point that they discussed. But then you have the issue of trying to talk about Saudi Arabia. Relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia right now is a topic of discussion. But right before Prime Minister Netanyahu went into that meeting, two Likud party members in his government wrote a letter warning Netanyahu not to give concessions to Saudi Arabia, notably regarding the Palestinians in these talks with President Biden, because it was rumored that in order for Saudi Arabia to come to the negotiating table and normalize ties with Israel, it wanted more concessions. So those were other issues that, of course, were discussed between the two sides. But nonetheless, it seemed that at least on the surface, it was very cordial.
All right, Susan, before I let you go, very quickly, we now understand that Russia has taken the podium at the United Nations Security Council meeting. Do we know more information about that? And also the meeting between President Biden and Zelensky?
Yeah, well, Russia, it's very interesting that the Russian ambassador here at the beginning of the UN Security Council meeting basically downplayed Vladimir Zelensky's concerns coming to New York, saying on the one hand, President Zelensky says that things are very bad in his country and he can't leave the battlefield and everyone is a soldier. But on the other hand, he has time to come all the way to Washington and meet with President Biden and ask for more aid. So a lot of back and forth at the UN Security Council between the Russians and the Ukrainians on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there is also this growing concern about, while this is a high-level meeting at the Security Council, how relevant will it be at the end of the day? Nothing major or a declaration of any sort is planned to come out of it, and it's just going to be maybe reduced to just a set of statements at the end of the day. Regarding Lula da Silva and President Biden, they're expected to not only discuss the environment, but also issues related to quote-unquote democracy. But make no mistake, after Lula da Silva's presentation at the UN General Assembly and his speech where he said dialogue and a negotiated settlement may be the only path forward to finding a solution to the Ukrainian war, I think President Biden will try to get Lula, perhaps not successfully, more on the side of Washington and the West in dealing with Russia against Ukraine.
All right, that is our correspondent Susan Teherani outside the United Nations headquarters, talking to us live from New York. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.